to the Richard B. Sodakow tutorial. My name is Burgess, and I'm a senior here at Emory University. The participants in this debate are Coppell representing the affirmative. The first affirmative is Het Desai, and the second affirmative is Shreyas Rajagopal. And Westminster is representing the negative. The first negative is Colin Ball. The second negative is George Alford. The evaluators of this debate are Professors Becca Steiner, George Lundeen, and myself. Thank you, and good luck.
Geoff.
Did I say that?
You said George.
I bet it auto-corrected my notes page.
See if I can find you some. Is anybody not ready? Perfect. We are in the midst of the race war. 21st century wave of xenophobia and racialized white nationalist hate has extended the order of modernity that re-embodied the inheritance of 1619 and manifest sector. Direct commercial cells and foreign military cells of armed cells are forged an internal debate over the expansion of humanity and all its hypocrisy. The global promise of white being determines the coordinates of an always unfolding violence is already steeped in an edifice of accessibility. Narratives of racial progress ignore the pre-established template for progress that's inextricably tied to white humanity reform or encapsulated within the order, fluctuating between waves and retreats and white supremacy as the backdrop. The establishment statecraft is a theater of racial nation building with facilitating movements, subtitles, post-civil rights, multiculturalism, research and white nationalism, post-racial liberalism, law and order, the war on drugs, the war on terror, and infrastructure of taunts and repression that are never finally separable. The race war is inseparable from logistics, the code of modernity that moved the sociopathic demands, the era of code-sanctioned killing of black and brown bodies. Modern logistics is commercial logistics. The first global movement of commodities required algorithmic regulation and arrangement of bodies and movement. So to secure the financialization that we witness today, armed sales policy, the code sutures itself a new kind of war, calling upon the perversive nature of policy as a means of staying such harmony at all. 18 modern logistics, commercial logistics, even today's military logistics, the most commonly outsourced to commercial firms who make huge profits off the logical temporary permanent war. The elements of trade is the birth of modern logistics, a new kind of war on the human species and racial capitalism. Trade entitled the first global route of vast commodities, finance and logistics are intertwined in today's global shipping industry. The story of the song is central. Modern logistics is about the sociopathic demand for topographical, jurisdictional, bodily, and associated access. Modern logistics is about controlling the flow and as ensuring the flow as much the interface of movement of commodities and the financialization, the elimination of good of cargo when the price falls to consideration of finance. The Zong, the slave, was worker on the line at the same time the supply coming off the line and into the line oriented where requires them to make it reversely more contingency. Logistics will always be white science, and the science of being white. The race war is not just out there but in here. Debate is a microcosm of the race war. Their so-called neutrality of fairness, predictability, stasis, clash, and topic education are ideological means of entry in which the protocols are not a negotiation of competing models but predetermined by the logistics of white being that seek those to fix that need to be fixed. Limits are not just limits on the topic but practices of the community. Clashes this debates a refusal to invite certain teams to round robins, policing and falling around black and brown debaters because their arguments are unsafe. Black debaters getting the cops called to them because their music is too loud. All proving the uniqueness question the race war and inseparability of the internal debate from debate as activity. White logistics and the race war have encroached upon the linguistic comments to the point where even thoughts themselves are quantifiable and financialized, wired around the psychic drive of anti-blackness. The mode of governance is internalized and replicated as violent practices of the race war. But as ubiquitous as the system sounds, it's always vulnerable to the system glitch. Neural findings are never supposed to happen. A movement that cannot be expropriated color, except in cognitive linguistic have undergone colonial expropriations. This overlaps with the violation of the social. These encroachments on the linguistic comments at the level of technical saturation present political has been lost. What can political meaning in a world characterized by algorithmic governance can platforms after the expropriation of cognitive linguistic right capital reduces descriptive production to the machine inequality sediment into machines operational justice to produce and reproduce a planetary culture founded upon racism. Machines can be understood as racial formation. Sociality is then programmed with a series of accumulation strategies operating through everyday consciousness, thought, rendered quantifiable, computable, and programmable. However, it is a mistake to imagine the impact of technology flows only in one direction. Technical form from emergent dialects of domination and struggle form from the ways that depressed outflank domination persists in living racialization, part and parcel of corporal inscription. The code works us and we work the code. This is at both the level of micro and macro level of struggle and organization. This is why no existing political discourse can approach the horizon. Current concepts of dot itself are fully circumscribed by idea themselves become operators fully functionalized by the matrix of information. It works that transfers colonizes nearly all mental, essential, and neural process while submitting them to interpersonal regimes of financialization of everyday life. Everyone is forced to continuously put information in order to manage brutality and risk. We are dealing with the overcoding of bodies and practices, the absorption of political energy by the strategy of accumulation. Politics and policy are today always on the side of the state, and the state is the state of capital. The adjudication of this internal debate is no different than logistics information as arms sales policy has corrected. But in this blur is the possibility of a horizon, one that problematizes the need for policy, one that is misimagined yet disimagined, an echo that asks the question, what would happen if the fleeting moment of anti-state here were socialized against its dense congruence? Thus, we affirm militant preservation as a reduction of direct commercial cells and foreign military cells of arms from the United States. As Bella reminds us, it is a mistake to imagine that logistics flows only in one direction. Militant preservation is the unsettling fear of the opposite flow, one that begins at the moment of sociopoiesis that harnesses the energy of sociality against perversive fixation of the policy. It refuses the violent corrective and violent touch of white being in favor of a new feeling, a haptic relationality where we open ourselves to the possibility of possibilities, one where we gather dispossessed feelings in common as we undercome the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, and for you to feel the feeling particularly youth. This is a field of insurgency, a field that refuses to be regulated under the jurisdictional doctrines of DCS and FMS that dictate the race war and its practice. It is the fugitive feeling of endurance felt by those in the hold of the horror of the first logistical cell. It is the reimagination of institutionality by Southeast Asian polity states who gathered and wandered the refuge within each becoming ungovernable. This is the sapping of individuation that happens via the forceful imposition of arms sales policy without understanding policy as a corrective in debate. It is the incompleteness in our political projects that inclines us towards one another. This is the apositionality being together yet against the very institutions that seek political and logistical control. That's Melbourne and 16 performative and repeated with each reading can be the rupture of institutionality works to undo in a stranger logic individualizing in their will to fix the sociality itself is resistant policies and getting for the form of political control. Command takes deputizes for a dispersed form of command which controls social reproduction by diagnosing incorrectness by those who represent to be in need of improvement. Bill and Hardy counterpose planning to policy begins with military preservation to escape the procedures of the policy. Bill and Hardy offer the associate points with the statement there's nothing wrong with us logistics counterize bodies, objects, affects, information to logistics. Hardy motor counterpose hapticality of love and capacity to feel through others for others to feel you, feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. So to put over imagination is as a term of the non-place of abolition of beneath and beyond the university inhabited by maroons, castaways, fugitives, and apositionality being together that renews our sense of institutions as a site where the form of appearance of social being and collectivity is determined through action and contest. Institutionality can be made anti to the powers to try to inhabit social being, otherwise reminding us that the radical change requires structure. What does it mean to be militant? Shakaitis and Graeber tell us it's the imminent process of resistance, one that is a source for social insurgency among the people who refuse to be passive victims of or willing participants in an oppressive system. The requirement that in the midst of the race war and logistics we have no choice but to analyze, strategize, and act on the surrounding social conditions. Movements are not just abstractions on an overlaying circuit on a global sphere, but ongoing resistance that happen in our thoughts, actions, provocations, and explorations. Our model debate seeks to ascend towards new levels of understanding the imminent process of resistance that unleash beautiful insurgencies from the ground up. This is work without a beginning, without an end, a constant process as opposed to policy that we take with us wherever we go. Shakaitis and Graeber 7 investigation, social research expand possibilities for political action. The work of military investigation, multiple extending and tackling between levels of understanding military investigation, discover new possibility in the present, turning data into the joyful insurgency. Halloway helped compile a book of the essays on the Zapatistas. When we write or when we read it, is not the word of the stream faced with mutilation of human life. Theoretical reflection is opposition next to the struggle from rage that is born. Liberatory struggle is ultimately the struggle against identity. True revolutionary knowledge would have to be a pragmatic form of knowledge that laid bare to all the potential deeply embedded in the logical transformation practices, furious debates ensued in Latin America. Arguments turned around very particular question of revolutionary strategy. Who has better role, the Zapatistas or Chavez's Bolivarian revolution? The role of the ballot is to abolish the white debate community. White spaces are contradictions seeking to organize without embracing what they disown. Meaningful cross-racial affinity can only be found in moments of revolutionary violence and self-defense. As Harney and 17 our enemies have been saved not by fashion but by democracy. Meaningful cross-racial affinity can only be found in moments of revolutionary violence and non-pacifist and for self-defense. All day reflective means that someone is indicating that now she or he wants to join that and accomplish the struggles of black white communities. A contradiction. The only thing between Jews abolishing communities and activities that are common people who are present as white. They're not allies. They have no place which to show this unless they embrace blackness with the whiteness to see their absence of violence, and white people have a big role to play in revolutionary violence.
Good. Yep. Okay. What are the conditions of victory in the race war?
There is no victory.
I guess why not?
Well, we think a system of logistics means that racism is sort of inevitable, or the race war is inevitable, but it's a question of endurance. I can explain the logistics.
I guess what evidence is there of that logistics?
We've read two pieces of evidence. First is the Beller evidence. It describes that anti-blackness and racism writ large is no longer a function of institutions enacting sort of violent practices of control, but rather is a function of neural processes that get encoded through moments of sociality.
Let's just take that. Like, why is that true? Why has that shift occurred?
Sure. The Beller evidence says that kind of the logistics, which is the birth of modernity, began from the first sale, which in this case, they're talking about the Middle Passage. But writ large, what they're saying is that this kind of movement was a movement of objects that became the kind of basis for the creation of an algorithm, and this algorithm is kind of where in which identities are not only pitted against each other, but also moving around.
And so there's also a process of containerization and individuation which sustains the system and makes political reform impossible. It says...
Well, I guess, why does that prove that institution or racism is not institutional?
Well, we've made a claim that it's a question of waves and retreats. So logistics will say and operate on a scale in which one step results in a retreat somewhere else. We've made claims that those things are part and parcel of a system of individuation to sustain the system itself via saying, look, there's something good happening. We should continue fighting for a telos of political reform, which individuates the need in order to be indebted to each other for no particular reason.
We'll debate that kind of spillover. Sure. I guess militant preservation,
yeah.
Why is it a good strategy for beating back things like xenophobia and racialized white nationalists?
Yeah, so we think that hapticality stops the process of individuation that creates social energy for each other, which is a prerequisite to any sort of political acts that we need to do. The Militant evidence also says that we need to reimagine institutions, not as sites of like the three branches or sort of like plugging in and playing in those places, but
what is the
spaces
role
of debate.
What is the role of violence and like militant preservation within that?
Wait, role of violence.
What does that
What's the
mean?
question?
Like, why does that like stopping the process of individuation with
Well,
hapticality,
individuation
why
is
does
the
that
reason
necessitate?
that violence takes place.
Why does that necessitate militant preservation?
Well, we think that militant preservation describes, the Militant evidence describes a process of hapticality, love, that stops the process of individuation, says that we should be in debt to each other, not for a particular telos,
So
not for a
like, why
particular
does
reason.
that kind of cause like the revolutionary violence
So
that the
we've read a
party
piece of
indicates?
evidence. Well,
creates that
the
cross-racial?
Beller evidence says that the code is the reason that that violence occurs and the reason that social energy is low in the status quo now. There's a reason that black and brown students are fighting for their lives. Tracing that code and creating neural processes that the state cannot understand. The state cannot co-opt affect.
Like,
The state
I
cannot
still don't
understand
understand
our
why
bodies.
tracing that code requires kind of like revolutionary violence.
We haven't
Maybe
said
there's, like,
revolutionary
is not
violence.
revolutionary
It's not revolution, it's not violence.
The
Okay.
role of the ballot is talking about how we can find cross-racial affinity in our indebtedness to each other, which is the one I see.
Okay. It should be sent. It is too often the case. Got some water.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Wait. Yeah.
Cool. First off is the critique only a foundational grounding and clear principles of nonviolence can facilitate a successful struggle for liberation. Domhoff, 5 several top leaders give up on nonviolence and working with whites. The long-term effects of violence were negative outbursts were understandable. They were nonetheless a political mistake. They was not possible to spread the word about why violent disorders are not a good idea. While they are happening, a new egalitarian movement would have to explain why they are unproductive before they are on the horizon. Not sit back and let them happen. The gulf expanded as these disruptions continued. Suspicion and anger were increased on both sides. Cities like Newark and Detroit still not recover from the withdrawal of investment. 35 years later, law and order became a code word for the enlargement of a criminal justice system that was used to control black communities. Voters expressed their approval of the hardline approach. Are also quite telling of negative consequences of violence, while public opinion liberalized on a wide range of issues can be by egalitarian movements. And what the other way to do own anything to do with violence. Belief in the necessity of violent struggle to overcome oppression is not a neutral concept grounded in fact. It's a result of an intentionally distorted history. The privileges aren't combat. The alternative is to reject violent resistance, which disrupts the dominant narrative of glorious battle for freedom in order to open new productive paths that enable successful politics. Markowski, 13. Historical accounts often tell of violent battles and insurrections, victories, and defeats, and wars, and fallen heroes. They ignore the power in historical world that nonviolent civilian-led resistance has played. A number of historical struggles were decisively waged through diverse methods of nonviolent resistance led by ordinary people. Nonviolent mobilization processes were critical more so than structural changes or violent revolutions that dominate the history of revolutionary struggles. These histories have been misinterpreted or erased altogether, buried beneath eulogized violence, commemorative rituals of glorified death and martyred heroes, and romanticized violent insurrections. Knowledge about historical events and processes is generated, distorted, and even ideologized in favor of violence driven structure-based interpretations and tensions centered on stories of violence ultimately laid on the quiet non-violent resistance of millions materially and militarily powerful empires have been defeated and completely unarmed opponents. Examples include the Spanish insurrectionists against Napoleon, the Chinese revolutionaries against the Japanese army in the north, Vietnamese against the United States as the South Vietnamese allies, and all of these supposedly violence-dominated conflicts. Military tools were subordinated to a broader political struggle by recovering the stories of non-violent actions. This however goes against the tide of prevailing views about struggles against foreign domination that fail to recognize and take into account the role and contribution of civil resistance. Violent resistance is intrinsically connected to violent masculinity and patriarchy. The move toward violence ensures resistance fail and subjugate those seen as weak. Markowski, 13 arms resistance is rooted in a warrior psychology that is shaped by violent masculinity and patriarchy. Struggles that congratulate violent bravery and reward machismo, leave little room for recognizing the importance of non-violent alternatives and the contributions of women or non-fighting age young men to the struggle of the discourse of hegemonic victims to conform to a masculinist contract that formed antiquity through the present has divided society into just warriors, male fighters, and predictors, and beautiful souls, female victims, and non-competences has inhibited people from remembering, acknowledging, and understanding the presence and efficacy of civil resistance, including the central place of women armed struggle and violent masculinity symbiotically joined. Doing both fails. Violent resistance hijacks non-violent resistance, ensuring failure and destruction. Markowski, 13 violent insurrections have lethal consequences. The former has often hijacked and compromised by civil resistance as previously achieved ones in military operations have supplied non-violent resistance. Adverse consequences have included an increasingly militarized and polarized society and a culture of violent armed resistance can quickly undermine non-violent mobilization across and solidarity between between various societal groups in search of violence provides justification for and reduces the political legitimacy cause of repression. They lack an appreciation of the remarkable degree to which nonviolent acts have liberated societies. Next off is T. The role of the ballot is to pass judgment on the efficacy of a topical proposal relevant to the status quo, relative to the status quo or competing option. The text of the resolution calls for it. Erickson. 3. Each topic contains an agent. The United States should adopt a policy. The agent as the subject should be to about a policy and action. The governmental means the debate is about whether something ought to occur. So do DCS and FMS. Sorensen. 9. FMS programs involve government weapons and system sales. Direct commercial sales are coordinated through the Office of Trade Controls of the State Department's Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. DCS is managed by the State Department. Violation. They're not topical. The impact is clash. Debates about scholarship and abstract ideas in a vacuum are myopic and generate bad debates. They allow the app to monopolize an infinite prep advantage because the only thing the app has to do is defend an ideological orientation toward the world. It kills clash because all they prevent extracts depend on a stable locus point for both teams to engage each other over by not defending a clear actor or mechanism. The app eliminates 90% of all negative ground while the app still retains normative competition standards like the permutation to make being negative possible. Clash is an intrinsic good and vital to the process of debate. Topicality is a procedural which comes before substance. It's a question of whether or not the debate should have happened. Clash both turns and solves the case. In-depth debates are important to determine best strategies for resistance and make us more self-reflexive and smarter, but tying the app to topical proposal is key to ensure the neg is equipped to do that, and it turns the case. Affirmative retention of normative competition standards like the perm forces to go as far right as possible, either impact turning or fighting on the wrong side of the race war, which is psychically violent per the 1AC. Case. There is not a race war, Riley. 20 resolutions have apparently never been better. Incidents required where so to a serious generational crime. The media sensational fixation has grown steadily in recent years. It is impossible not to see media coverage go as a factor of contributing to this malaise. Right-wing media take the tack of sensationalizing virtually every prominent story. Black on white crime, the right-wing is the black on white crime archive. It is actually have an epidemic of oil black crimes or an epidemic of British black on white crimes. The answer is neither statistics so thoroughly refute. Fear-mongering that Americans should take the media to task for the voice of false version of reality. They present their realities far from the race war fantasies of extremists on either side. The absolute agencies of the absolute absence of American race wars, the most obvious in murderers figures indicate that roughly 85% of murderers are interracial. The big picture of interracial crime and ethnic conflict more broadly is surprisingly positive. There is no current or upcoming race war, indeed general epidemic of interracial violence. Their use of the concept is bad. Race war framing has been entirely co-opted by white supremacists, and it has origin in white fears of the slave result. The app fulfills Nazi fantasies. ADL 20. The concept of a race war is gaining popularity among white supremacists. Neo-Nazi groups claim that very purpose is to prepare for the race war. The white supremacists use a variety of slogans to evoke race war. They use this to divide a large-scale apocalyptic collapse between racist conflicts of race war have a long history originating in fears of massacre, several insurrection, or slave rebellion in antebellum America during the Civil War. Americans fearful that emancipated blacks could not peacefully coexist. One of the prospect of a race war discussion of a race war no longer a mainstream but are constrained to white supremacist discourse embracing race war. The most radical approach to race war is to equally embrace the idea that this has become a match with the white supremacist accelerationism. Acceleration is see anything that can hasten society's collapse is desirable. Statistics prove that violence is totally ineffective at causing political change. Martin A. Freedom House published a study of 67 political transition authors assess comparative roles of nonviolence, nonviolence forces are a major suppression. There is little effect for top-down transitions they launch by elites. The presence of strong and cohesive nonviolent civic coalitions is the most important factor in contributing to freedom. Prospects are enhanced when the opposition does not use violence. Stiffen and Chenoweth analyzed 323 resistance campaigns, concluding nonviolent campaigns are more likely to achieve strategic objectives. Armed campaigns offer the opponent a justification for violent counterattacks and are less likely to prompt loyalty shifts and defections. Learning to seize power through institutional dynamics is a better idea than the app. Spence 15 in a moment when all seemed lost our ability to argue for public good still exists in institutions and populations we've written off because we believe they are incapable of radical political action. Black youth that exists in Jackson, Mississippi. Black youth organized in Retro Maryland legislators to kill the prison Malcolm X grassroots movement made electing a Lumumba a component of the organizing the CTU chose to take the city off the city head on and chose a series of town hall meetings designed to inform people on the ways that political officials are working to kill public education. Black Lives Matter recognized politics was at the center of their struggle in Ferguson. All use moral language, however, they didn't rely on those arguments. They understood seizing power rather than speaking truth to it. That proposing new alternatives would involve a political struggle. Morality can make it hard to move against charters to go proponent who sincerely believes privatizing as goals to represents the best hope. We should never ignore the fundamental role of politics plays and should play people to not come to a common understanding of structural dynamics of what the solution should be. They're being exposed to living without having the space to talk about the issues in depth over a long period of time. Marked a long period of time, anti-blackness is not ontological since the world is not a static entity predisposed to subordination, but is rather constantly subject to a process of changing and becoming. The notion that there is no victory in the race war is bad. Gordon 18 existentialists reject notions of human nature on the grounds that human beings live in worlds. They also construct an anti-black world is not identical with the world as anti-black. Such a world as an anti-black racist project is not the historical achievement of black people and other opponents. Such a project flawed and getting unified as we see Black Lives Matter. The same argument applies to social that the basic premises of Afro-pessimistic argument are blocked and performative contradictions. The absence of agency would reinforce the racial logical blacks and the effect of words of white without agency, politics, and responsibility would not be possible. We should avoid the fallacy of confusing source with outcome. Pessimism is the other side of optimism, both are connected to nihilism. When people no longer want to be responsible for their actions, the future unlike transcendental conditions, however, is exposed factor. It is yet to come. The question is what will be or how do we know what will be, but instead the realization that whatever is done will be that on which the future will depend. rejecting optimism and pessimism. There's supervening alternative political commitment. After pessimism suffers from a failure to understand. Failure to achievement with it being with a is a constant negotiation of ongoing efforts to build a relationship with others. Marked it with others.
Good.
Yeah.
Cool. What part of the AF is armed resistance?
So there are a couple of quotes that we can pull in the block from the AF. The most important ones, I think, are the discussion of militant preservation and kind of self-defense we'll make indicts of. Also the revolutionary violence per the Harney card, and the tag of the Shukaitis card says provocations are important in the context of the race war.
Wait,
We think that all of those are wrong.
The militancy stuff, militant preservation, we've read a card that says that militant preservation is a form of haptic care. What part of the card do you think says that that is violent, takes up arms, or is against the state?
Well, so it's not just a question of haptic care, but we think that militant preservation kind of against white being necessitates a violent reaction in the context of the AF.
These are the context say like the move towards violence ensures resistance fails.
Yes.
Our argument is about endurance, not sort of resisting or creating movements against.
Well,
the
no,
state.
you said you absolutely resist white being per a tag of the 1AC. We think that that would necessitate violence.
Okay, cool. So there's not a race war, sure. Things like this Riley evidence says that race relations are getting better. Why does that mean the race war is over?
So I'm confused about the question. The argument is that there is not a race war. The examples given in the 1AC are kind of spectacularized examples that we don't think are constitutive of a broader
You said
trend.
there's a race war. You're like, well, it's not that bad. Why do you
No,
think
the
race war
Riley
is over?
evidence definitively concludes that there is not one
There's
at all.
no violence that happens to black people.
No, there is, but in general, it is declining, and we don't think that the initial conditions were sufficient to call call it a race war.
Clash. Walk me
Yes.
through how a topical debate, someone imagines that we reduce arms sales from Taiwan, results in social energy for black and brown students.
So the argument is essentially that topical debate results in third and fourth line testing. We think that that's good because it makes us more self-reflexive. We have to be af and neg against the same arguments, right? We think that that makes us smarter. One, enables better resistance, but two, it's just better for debate, which I think we've all kind of
That
agreed is
wasn't
good.
my question. Like, that's a generic clash good block, cool. I'm saying, why does clash lead to social energy for black and brown students?
Well, I don't know if we've made an argument about social energy, but we do think that we've made an argument about self-reflexivity and better decision-making in the context of resistance.
Do you, that decision making, do you have to win your case arguments to win clash is good?
Don't think so.
Why do you think clash is an intrinsic good?
Because it makes us smarter and enables better resistance, which is the,
So
quote, generic clash good
clashing
block that I
you will
read off
defend that
above.
clashing over unethical policies is good because it
Well,
makes us smarter.
so, no, we don't think that most debates are unethical, but also,
You have
if
to
you
win
go
the
for
case.
that, then, sure, because we think
cool,
that
cool.
it would be a good idea to kind of build that self-reflexivity, right? When you have to be neg against an unethical af, you have to endorse the idea that maybe that is not a good
The
idea.
alternative, do the movements of non-violence engage the state?
I don't think the 1NC has made a claim about that.
So the movements of non-violence just don't.
It's not like a yes/no question. It's just if the 2AC makes an argument, we'll react. But the 1AC,
Well,
the 1NC has not answered that question.
You said we should do non-violence. I'm wondering where does that non-violence go?
So it engages the state insofar as that it is a movement to change the state,
It's
and
a
also,
movement against
but
the state.
also secondarily everyday life. And we think
you
that
said anti-blackness is ontological when?
what? It's an
Is it-
argument about the race war.
Is this important? Yeah. All right, I'm saving this speech time.
Thank you.
It's sent. I'm just gonna run to the restroom.
That's so true, actually. Oh my god. Like, imagine having bio tomorrow. Broke. What?
I start with the 3 on the
Oh, that's kind of. Wait, what's the first period?
1. We start with 8 a.m.
First period free. That's weird. Here we go.
Maybe that's the combination of your charger. Actually, I'll say maybe.
the non-violence critique, and then T.
Is there a separate sheet worthy overview?
For case?
Yeah.
I don't think you need a
Okay.
new sheet.
I trust you.
A classic 30-second overview of the team's read.
Sorry. You said no and then
I mean, like, you can. Like,
Hey, I added like 6 cells too.
Amazing.
yeah. Everyone good?
Vote affirmative for a policy of military preservation that traces the logistical code of DCS FMS and revitalizes social socialities and neural blockage that stops the process of individuation to endure the ongoing resource and mode of mutual indebtedness against wide institutional violence, similar to the field of the older South Asian policies, but oriented as a blockage of the logistical system that discussions of DCS FMS are framed with the uniqueness question makes the average triad the race war. This here and happening that the alt-right freaking extrajudicial killings and anti-black debate practices like black debaters giving the cops called the clashes of the nature of round robin striking the black church, the role of the maladies to abolish the white debate community. Cross-racial affinity can only be found in our mutual indebtedness to blackness as the mode in harmony. Evidence doesn't conclude the necessity for violence, which will be later on the non-violence key. The first argument I have there's not a race war. Yes, there's a race war. First examples in our theory of logistics in the overview. Proof second, it operates in waves of retreats. That was answered about which means that their examples are just uniqueness for resurgency. Third, even if they win that it's not out there, it's most definitely in here. Fourth, there's a tactic of pacification that diverts energy from being able to endure racism, which is a pacification design. Sixth, fifth, the race war is having the subject is in 09 war is least closely the ideas of the USA pursues a coherent consensus of war. This was just looking at the balance of aliens of the whole aware in the militarization of the war on terror, not content to the coherent the organization of coming up with mobilization of the racist state in a recognition of violence. The state ordering violence has happened rendered within the American domestic social formation organized the human fatality, pathologized social nation the state has reinforced descent of dominance through multiculturalism, corporations, and state crafty. Next argument, the Nazis already think that the Nazis already think this, which means that it's not unique offense for you, but it characterizes the way in which creates a surge of but it characterizes it in the way it creates a surge of urgency for black and brown students that incentivize situations that we link turn. That also the argument is terrible silence of black and brown students that are enjoying the race that are forcing them to re-articulate themselves palatable to white people. Is also a description of the status quo. There's only a risk that the R method solves the second piece of evidence in the context of journalism asking two sides and implying imbalance. None of which is the violence fails argument. Not as will be later on the case that Spence argument one. The whiteness is the normative ground of institutions. It operates in surges and retreats. When I see Rodriguez index, there are others examples of progressive reform because they're always offset with a surge of violence, i.e. slavery to Jim Crow to prison industrial complex. Second is that we have a theory of logistics. When I see Miller says the violence has transitioned to the era of the code instilled within our cognitive linguistic functions. Institutional reform reorients the code that expands the code, but formation of the algorithm itself is based off of expropriated communicative and racial violence. Third, we've reimagined institutions based on ungovernability, sociality, i.e. the potty states examples. That's the Militant as the ontology argument. We haven't described it as ontological, but rather of the code. Their argument is that this is a question of ontology in the sense of defining human, whereas we've said that regardless of the incompleteness of the human is entrapped within logistics. Which means that Gordon either flows af and proves the argument about how it's a question of the code, not necessarily a question of defining the human. The algorithm controls the way in which modernity operates.
Non-violence, K.
This critique is not linked to us most definitely because the 1AC is not a strategy of violence. We prescribe militant preservation in the sense of sociality, i.e. being able to endure the race war together. The 1AC militant evidence and the logistical sabotage argument that I'll read on most definitely conclude affirmative because the process of militant preservation is one of refuge in which we create love for each other, i.e. how we're able to create a new form of relationality that develops sociality to challenge logistics, not via institutional or violent formations, but rather via the ability to create those relationalities in the first place. We are a prerequisite. The 1AC first and foremost, the militant preservation, which is not violence, but recreating those social relations by disrupting the social order. Is a heuristic for organizing that refuses its imposition. The alternative is a continuous waging of war, which non-uniques the impacts that they've gone for. Harney says that is for black and brown students, it's a question of aligning ourselves in the struggle of blackness. You're reading it wrong. That Harney and something I'm reading right. That can be violent, but do words like solidarity, affinity, to say nothing of the unlovable term allyship accidentally preserve something that we want to abolish. This question comes up. This means that someone has his or her own struggles that is indicating that now he or she wants to join not in common struggles, but in the struggles of blackness. There's Shakaitis evidence is not only a question of models of debate. We have said that the F is a question of apositionality, not oppositionality, which is why Shakaitis most definitely concludes affirmative, and the 1AC is a prerequisite because the critiques don't link to our model debate, but the actual 1AC of this argument is also non-unique. Black and brown students are always considered violent because of how they are anti-logistical permutation to both. You've misunderstood the affirmative. It's a question of living in the intimacy of living in brokenness of modern hardy. 15, when we move, we assemble, disassemble, and you in, and as our honor come and applicability, but we make active line on doing the undoing of every single particle, when you assembling the general assembly, our disassembly, often and off, letting the other moves, because our doing and undoing the same as two. Move wrong and not move, happen, decision of celebration, logistical capital, so move wrong is tonight, acts as a capital, having such time, punishable by digital value, and survives whenever one way, the other foundation of the eternal order, society, time to logical, only first horrible logistics, still not continues, improvement towards towards total year, and violently better text, the right to individuality, those who keep moving wrong, and those ones holding up, the production line that's supposed to be preserved, like being included with one another, the card of one another, they pick and choose parts of the app which ignores the thesis of society, that's cryptocentrism, that's congregate, and also arrogance is cryptocentrism, authority of the era of highly educated people who merely fail to notice other forms, even when researchers do attend to actual linguistic human action and embodied domestic conditions. Those texts to be read, these corporate censors, the Western imperialism, so Walton groups texts are often an access while threatening charge with the regulatory power of the state. The hegemonic technology needs to be exposed and under my choice, which is not allowed. Transparent, the martial card of transparent, their calls for non-violence or violence Hockland. They know for the notion of non-violent relations based on suppression of alterity and denies the radical unpredictability of the other, the command of respect of the other. Does that make sense? If the other wants to destroy me, the dream of community with violence, that is a dream of community which there would be nothing other than peace. Mark the card at peace. T. Debate is not a game, but a microcosm of the race war. Their moves to procedurals upholds the internal debate of why being that acts as a corrective to reinstantiate its protocols, put procedurals on hold of the race war because competitive protocols can't be divorced from the social motorization of debate itself. Form is content. One C. Ballard says the content of linguistics has been suffocated by an algorithmic mode of governance which necessitates the harvest of life proofs. The ballot war because it shows us a neurological rewiring that reprograms everyday consciousness towards sociality, which is also a spill out desire. Their model results in psychic burnout that stays off militant potentiality in favor of maximizing logistical clash and procedures. Counter-term absence defending militant reading of the resolution. Shakaitis defines this as anti-logistical sociality, which forces affirmatives to define militant strategies to fight to endure the race war under which GCSFMS have been framed. We flip the scripts for limits. It's no longer a policy but planning. The limits is planning is how we develop affect into politics when we use the side of our politics away from logistics preferred. One is the militant skills. One is Shakaitis the debates over resistance strategies are key for those living through the race war because the only predictable debate is over the race war. Only our model allows for comparison of different resistance strategies like the BLM versus Zapatistas or BBB, which generates skills and energy to fight the race war. Second is that their vision of a predictable stasis point is not a neutral negotiation but presumptive of assumptions under their terms of the internal debate, i.e. the demand for fiat, even though the lack of resolutional basis upholds the protocols of the race war. This has to their model. First is suspended futurity that Sullivan and 17. Black Americans in strategies explaining me all liberal faith can function as a cruel optimism with evidence of the health sciences that black hope and damage to the psychosomatic health structures flourishing in the black world. Survival has been linked to lead to depression, tension, and generalized anxiety disorder in African Americans, high rates of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and birth and mortality. These effects, moreover, can be transformational. Second is a pacification decide their disavowal that the internal debate in favor of the American polity is a frame for debate pacifies militant preservation as politics which gives into whiteness and its demands switch side forces oppositionality and not apositionality, which is what Militant describes as the only way to imagine militant preservation as socio-poesis rather than reactionary. Third is an individuation is that their focus on U.S. institution policies are political projects as complete, which allows logistics to infiltrate and individuate our embodied affect and forces us to submit to coercive power. When we start with the presumption of violence out there, we never understand violence in here, which is the only way to trace our psychic investments. Third, fourth is the question of their call sources are bad, you should project them as Kelsey, and anti the looming crisis within the parties arrives. The desire for an overturning to normalcy and civility invites us to rethink debate rather than making debate corners that so you debate as a dialectical and agonistic contestation must one have a presupposed potentiality for common ground, reducing this self-mind and able to move accurately thinking for turning rubber against a presupposition for ground as a war against its own way by ancient logic to say that debate is impossible to back in war on the horizons of recognizing state of emergency. We are thrown away the race where the TVA is not competitive or responsive, so debate could look like, not what debate has to look like, which means that it doesn't resolve our offense about only militant skills, not fairness, suggestion internal, like if we want our research model is the best way to generate militant skills, then you vote. You should be willing to risk it all for a better and more ethical model debate. There's also no fairness in race where their move maximizes the status quo order that also keeps antagonisms at bay. The clash offense exclusion turns at risk that you exclude micro-political strategy. It means that they link into a white echo chamber. Debate is the side of ideological warfare that regulates who can participate in dialogue, a vision of clash that adds black participants and stirs a superficial multiculturalism that intensifies racial trade that's hawthorne and has 18. The academy can regulate who can participate in dialogue. A partisan not black people and stories a political process superficial inclusion clips of dialogue are frequently invoked to experience lack of engagement. We should be striving for something more radical than dialogue. The materiality of intellectual inquiry refuse the curse of service of black scholarship and necessitates a positive engagement. We reject the pressures of the academy, generates some black scholars have card spaces even when not offered a seat at the table. We entered into we are co-signing the black radical deciding the black radical tradition mark the card at tradition defense. Fiat is actually topical policy advantages like hedge and warming aren't intrinsic but repeated, which disproves resolutional predictability. Limits explosion is not unique. The topic is bidirectional. Their interpretation says that the only way to ruse GCSFMS is to remove from the USML, which means there's less restrictions to purchasing weapons since arms are governed now by the DOC makes more than 14,000 possible apps. Also, they don't even have an interpretation. They've only said that the goal is about to determine a topical level of plan, which we've impact turned on case with the Emory Hardy evidence that it should be a question of indebtedness to blackness, reasonability, prefer arbitrary inclusions to arbitrary exclusions, competing in terms of reward, over limiting in terms of the expense of ethics. If we aren't reasonable, K teams will be atopical, which turns our chairs.
Okay.
Give me a second. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Cool. Why vote F?
We have presented a method that's good.
Okay.
In the case of if it's in the frame of if it's in the context
Just
of
like in the context of the
topicality,
case.
then in the context of the case, militant preservation is a good idea
Good idea for who?
for black and brown students fighting the race war.
Okay. I guess, so why should the AF be debated about?
I'm sorry, what?
Why should the AF be debated about?
Because the race war is real, happening now. It's in debate. We should talk about strategies to endure the race war.
Why is it a good idea to say any of that is wrong?
No. Shakaitis and Graeber describes our model of debate.
Yeah.
It does not say that you have to say the race war is not happening. It does not say you have to say the race war
competing
is good.
strategies.
But it's competing strategies. They say that model of debate is good because
Okay.
it creates energy for the students that are fighting it now.
Yeah.
What is the answer in the context of like a competitive space to like normative competition standards like the permutation? in like method v method debates.
Well, the Shakaitis-Graeber evidence kind of preempts the conception of a permutation, since that these theories are dialectically opposed. The example the Graeber evidence gives is, for example, debates that happened between the Bolivarian Revolution and kind of BPP, and how that interacted with things like the Zapatistas, and how they found dissimilarities and were able to refine those strategies to kind of produce a better praxis.
Okay, so if that is true, I guess what is the incentive for the negative to like research about it? Or like what is the basis for the negative
Well,
research?
so you just said competition drives incentives for research. We say our model of debate should be a militant reading of the resolution, which means under competition, negative teams are forced to research militant strategies. It forces them to find strategies that are different from the app. Your idea about permutations is like you just have to win a link.
Wait, what is the internal link to that? It's like how does the app ensure that neg teams don't just impact it?
So wait, impact. Like,
You're gonna, like, neg teams are gonna say race we're good?
Yeah. Like how does the app ensure that that doesn't happen?
that's the status quo. Like people can say race war good in the status quo. We think our model of debate incentivizes militant research because it promotes debates over them. It says that the app should not start from a point of like, governmental
Also,
reform,
like,
because that's bad.
ethics standards exist. Like, no one's gonna say killing black and brown students good.
Okay, that's fair. The critique, I guess,
Yeah.
if it is a question of like militant preservation,
Yes.
what does that look like? Like, I guess in the
Sure.
context of the race war, when you have made a claim that
Yeah.
like violence against black and brown bodies is ongoing.
Yeah, so like that's the logistics arguments about how it's ongoing. The 1AC, militant preservation, looks like a different thing. Looks like a couple different things. The Militant evidence says militant preservation is a form of sociopoiesis that's able to create sociality, which blocks the system of logistics, which is what's kind of ongoing in the race war, to create moments of social energy. We give examples of militant preservation.
Yeah,
like
okay,
the
what does
field-
that social energy do?
So to clarify, it's not like a physical action. Like there is no one physical
Yeah, no.
action that black and brown students do, but we think social energy allows people to endure the race war. Like they physically need the energy to wake up, to physically need the energy to do things, need the energy to like form
Okay,
groups.
what response does the app propose in the face of like life-threatening violence?
Well, we think that violence is inevitable, i.e. logistics will always have life-threatening violence. The question of endurance and strategies, we think that the app is.
What was the card that you marked as peace? I think it was on the K.
Give me a second. Let me find it. Let's see. Well, I did mark the Moten and Harney evidence at one another. Conquer Good was marked at transparent. And, Haglund and Fort was the one that was marked
Got
at
it.
peace.
Okay.
Yeah.
542.
How much did you say?
542. Okay.
Cards?
Yeah, they're cinched, the two in the body.
Okay.
Okay. We all good for an order?
Sorry, where'd you stop, Prep?
5, 4, 2.
Yeah. Okay. It's going to be the case page and then T. Okay. Is everyone not ready? Great. The solvency level is incoherent. The government and all the kind of white nationalists that the 1EC evidence critiques are super armed and have tanks and a bunch of other weapons. The logistics of the race war just make it impossible to win or even endure, even if they are able to mobilize effectively and kind of create the communities of Topicality that are able to resist. Demonstrations like Richmond, Charlottesville, and other white nationalist organizations mean that their strategy is not effective because white nationalists will inevitably just kind of just overwhelm in a world where it will inevitably overwhelm. This is solvency defense and offense. This is just terminal solvency defense for us in a world where they can't access the race war frame. The central thesis of the AF is epistemologically bankrupt. There is not a race war. Their authors are English professors who use inflammatory language but massively lack empirical data. There have been some compelling anecdotes, but those just prove it that there are problematic policies in place, not that the government is irredeemably racist. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they haven't provided enough actual statistics and studies so that in 2019 was one of the best years for race relations in recent memory, and claims to the contrary are result of media sensational. That's what Riley Evans' race war framing is uniquely bad. It actually, honestly, the line behind all the examples are just kind of anecdotal, which the Riley evidence uniquely indicts that it doesn't prove uniqueness for the kind of resurgency, but rather it's just kind of it disproves the theory that that there is sustained kind of violence going on. It also doesn't direct energy away from those kind of resurgencies if we win that the race war is not happening. This is also offense for us. The race war framing is uniquely bad. It actively buys into white supremacists and Nazi fancies that claim to spark a race war to take Black America for their own purposes. You should be seriously skeptical of their framing. Anything that gives the Nazis exactly what they want is probably bad. The uniqueness argument, it's not true. The framing of the race war and kind of extrapolating it to society at large and the debate stage is uniquely bad. If we the 1C ADL evidence indicates that kind of extrapolating is what causes Nazi feeling down. This is also offense for us. It's not just a critique of their framing the abstract. Using race war language to argue for Black militancy means that white nationalists will see the AF as an impending threat to the threat of the survival of their race, and they'll preemptively strike. It's empirically proven. That's Miller in 19. The race war faded from nationalist conversation. Civil rights era when King were pains to portray their efforts as peaceful. White supremacy movement became less mainstream. However, the rise more militant. Black movement, prominent white supremacists again. A warning of trying to spark a race war. The defense from those who did not want to interrogate white racism was to say that Black groups who were attacking white people and launching a race war. The Spence and Gordon evidence. We're not going for it as an ontology claim, but rather just political pessimism is wrong. They both go negative. Only debating institutional dynamics can produce material change in the conditions that resolve the violence outlined in the 1AC. The AF forecloses that possibility. It makes any movement kind of ineffective. It doesn't matter if they reconceptualize institutions, but rather just an immediate foreclosure of engaging in them as they currently stand is wrong. The Gordon evidence indicates that racism is still institutionally arranged, and 1AC Cross-X couldn't provide kind of a reason why logistics mean that it's coded in our minds. Gordon directly indicts that and kind of says that is a false theory and is not proven by any scientific evidence, but rather is a political arrangement that means that only strategies of again the political can solve. T. Our interpretation of the AF teams must defend the United States federal government should essentially decrease direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales of arms to the United States. The plan finalized it doesn't defend the proposal as such. There is zero risk of AF offense because debate is fundamentally competitive activity and nothing more. This means that maximizing clash must be a prerequisite to weighing the AF independently. Clash AF access to all AF offense. Two reasons. First, that it structures the game. Clash is the most important piece of debate. There's a reason that people dedicate cumulatively months to preparing for this activity. That's because good debates require thorough, in-depth clash over an agreed upon point of state to sustain the activity. Second, that it turns AF offense. It's necessary to form their fighting the race war and being able to build movements. Even if they win that the AF is true, evaluate T on a prior basis. We should not be required to meet the threshold underneath the 1AC because it was untopical. You should presume the 1AC to also be false or their strategy not to work because the neg didn't have a chance to thoroughly indicate it. Switch side solves all their offense. Most 1AC arguments are criticism of the revolution. That's great neg ground. We switch sides during a turn for a reason. It's so we're able to clash on both sides of the issue, but because of that, we don't become attached to far right arguments because of the inherent distancing effect when we have a debate about both sides. Debate, it's a game, but it's also more so a competitive activity between two sides that necessarily have to be equally prepared in order to clash upon a point of stasis. Form is not content. That distinction is false and assumes a caricature of topical debate. Topicality and requiring that you read a plan is just a mandate that you read a plan, not a kind of not a mandate on anything else. The ballot kind of psychological violence, it also is that this impact is talking about the debate community outside, which in a world where the counterinterpretation has to have a high level of solvency and totally affecting the debate community and changing it, which also answers the psychological burnout argument, because it's about other examples. The examples given in the 1AT, like not inviting teams to round robin and people following around black and brown debates, are not solved by their counterinterpretation. So it's only a risk that clash can be the only thing that gets solved. The counterinterpretation, it's bad. You should reject it. It doesn't set a predictable limit on the topic, and it doesn't create a vision of the topic based on words in the resolution, which is the only predictable limit. Two internal links are offense that only our interpretation acts as. First is limits that absent interpretation justifies an infinite number of actors and infinite number of possible advocacies. Just do the math. That means that there's no predictable math limit on the topic for two direct research, which means that we reflex a generic side capitalism, critique which kills class. Second is net ground. Their interpretation negates 90% of all topic dishousing counterclaims that have been prepared pre-round and pre-term. Nearly all net ground is premised on the AFT defending government action, like reducing arms sales from the United States. We don't get core generics like the fill-in. Just had alliances, had DIB deterrence, or any core counterclaims. The militant skills clash in accessing a plan reading a plan accesses this. This is not unique offense against our against our interpretation. There is no intrinsic reason why reading a plan kind of forecloses the discussion of militant skills in fighting the race war. If they win the race war is happening, then it's probably happening external to the United States and internationally, which proves that international discussions of how to arm countries how to arm countries that are black and have access to weapons like the Sabotage Act, that proves that we are able to develop kind of militant skills or work on strategies to fight the race war, not necessarily in this debate space, but also outside. There's also zero reason why not fighting it in the debate space means that it's uniquely bad. The stasis part, it's not assumptive. The stasis is just a question of what we debate about, not about either who is debating or what kind of arguments are arguments are presented. As long as there's a stasis point for both teams to engage over the kind of suspended in futurity argument. This argument is wrong, but we'll turn it anyways. As McKelly and Tempany, there's real scientific evidence occurring at an accelerated rate. The optimistic disposition leads to better health. Optimism is likely to be in ideal cardiovascular health. That individuals recover more quickly. Optimism appears associated with lower levels of distress, lower disease progression, and improved survival rates. Numerous studies show that the subjective well-being is associated with longer improved longevity compared to the individuals who maintain a negative disposition regarding their health or future. The direct evidence optimism reaches down to the molecular level. People with optimistic attitude have lower levels of IL-6 responsible for vascular plague and cardiac disease. Optimists live longer. There are several studies that subjective well-being is associated with longer longevity. Research interviewed approximately 1,000 men and women between the ages of 60 and 85. The APC found similar results. The research used data from 100,000 women over age 50. Participants completed a questionnaire that measured optimism. Women who showed the highest optimism were 40% more likely to be alive. Pessimistic black women for 33 more likely to have died after 8 years than optimistic black women. The individuation just said the reading a plan doesn't allow logistics to kind of infiltrate doesn't allow logistics to infiltrate the debate space. This assumes a character debate where we don't focus on militant skills. So the kind of claims that about how clash and reading a plan don't necessarily foreclose that, but also allow for those discussions necessarily probably linked to the stasis is bad. The Kelsey argument assumes a world of civility in topical debate. That's false, and again assumes the kind of character where we all just read the Taiwan Act and the deterrence, but that's not necessarily what a topic debate has to be. It's just a restriction on whether or not they read a plan, not on whether or not we all read the Taiwan Act. The better model debate, the AFT cannot access system without a fundamental overthrow of the current situation of the debate, which the counterinterpretation cannot access. Exclusion just said it's wrong. The work that I did above, it doesn't result in kind of exclusion of people, just of whether or not you read a plan, which means that Topicality is fundamentally just not a restriction on the kind of people that are in debates or relative arguments that are presented. It's only a restriction on whether or not you read a plan. Fiat being extra T, that's not a reason why we can't clash over it, because we still get a stasis point. The limits being not unique is wrong. The functional limits like the DIB and other stuff that I did above checks. Yes, we have an interpretation. That was the 1 and C, the Sorensen evidence. Reasonability, it's bad. It's also, your F is not reasonable. It justifies judge intervention. That's bad. Kills clash.
Cool. You good?
Yeah.
You said clash allows for militant skills, and then you cited your app that you read. Round 3 of the tournament, you read the app. We asked you what skills you gained from the affirmative. We asked you who goes to the meetings. What skills have you learned? And your answer was fiat. Please explain how.
No, it wasn't.
Okay,
That was your answer. She was
okay.
joking,
Well,
so.
regardless, that doesn't prove that every single app does not involve that. We think that there can be strategies in a plan
when
to
we
examine how.
government action, right? We say that the plan goes through. What sort of skills does that give debaters?
What do you mean in terms of
Like you said, it creates
just
sabotage skills. It allows us to infiltrate the government, and then you said that's also race war.
Sure.
Imagining that a world in which the plan is passed gives us what skills and how?
in the context of clash, we haven't made a skills argument. In the context of turning the militant skills argument, we think that there can be externally of just fiating the plan, discussing how reading a plan and reducing arms sales can impact how the race war is being fought outside of the U.S. is a good discussion to have.
Okay, so you
and those
think-
discussions can be had.
So you think that just imagining those things and saying, well, resolving that
That's,
somehow
scenario
creates
design.
better ethical subjects?
Yes, because it allows us to analyze how the race war is being fought, how we can fight it more effectively.
Or that's my
examine more
point. How can we fight
strategies
it more
like
effectively?
that.
What is the internal
Like
link
the-
between imagining the government do something and strategies and tactics to fight it more effectively?
Because-
We are not policymakers. We are not in the government.
Yeah,
What do we do now?
Obviously, reading a plan and kind of examining the ways that, in the context of foreign military sales, it would probably be other countries being engaged in fighting the race war. But there's also multiple domestic arguments, like the 1033 dissent,
we've
which is
said-
that
we've said-
reducing arms sales, stop arms sales to police, or start arms sales to police organizations, and how that might influence the race war.
We said violence happens to black and brown students right now. And you said, well, they get skills so that later, when they grow up, they can affect the 1033 program.
Well,
Well,
it's also
what do they do
It's not
until
just
then?
about literal policy change. We also think it makes us more self-reflexive and enables better
So
resistance.
we are now self-reflexive. What does that do for black and brown students?
It-
Do they
as
know
ho-
what to do with self-reflexivity?
As Holland just said, it enables us to be a little bit not even a little bit, just more resistant to the structures that
What-
are
it's
oppressive in today's society, like institutional
I'll move
racism.
on. You're not hitting it. The counterplans dissent, you assert that we do not get that ground. Why is
Yeah.
the ground good?
It's key to clash. It's
So, okay, Clash,
prepared
the
opponents
overview
is
is
good.
it's an intrinsic good because it structures the game with
Yeah.
impact turn the game and said it's a part of the race war. Will you
Yeah,
defend that Clash during a race war is good?
Yes, we think that
Interesting.
clash, more clash is good.
Sure.
It's a sliding
Uh,
scale. There's
The
not
debate is a
enough
game
clash.
activity. Can games, or the argument, can games be racialized?
I think, in what way? In terms of the activity being racialized, the community, yes. But in terms of reading a plan and that kind of competitive activity where both sides engage over a stasis point, no.
Okay, it's done. It is. There's a solid overview. Okay, is everyone good?
Give me 1 second. Yeah.
Good, cool. Violent resistance is a bad strategy and does not cause transformative politics. There are three impacted criticisms that outweigh the case. The first is gendered violence. The one he sees discussion of militant preservation, revolutionary violence for the last undercard and their provocations isn't a neutral choice. It's a conscious effort to elevate narratives of glorious battle and courageous strength, which inherently privileges traits that are normatively understood as masculine and then purges those as seen as weak. That should come first. As white men, we obviously enjoy significant privilege within this space, but the one he sees on critical approach to violence ensures perpetuation of male domination. In the context of racial liberation, it ensures failure and magnifies sexism. Hooks 95 of any black women chooses to speak out about race from a standpoint that includes feminism, where you're saying is really the more important political discussions. Audiences what to think of herself within black listeners about things and assume that the real political leaders will always be the male, not listening to the voices of progressive black women, mean that black political discourse on the race always suffers from critical gaps and theoretical vision and concrete strategy. Second is needless violence. Their strategy empirically has led to wanton destruction of any and all residual elements of society that are deemed to disappear. Their impact is collateral damage. Violence ensures that inevitably civilians and innocent bystanders are killed. That should be rejected. We can recognize that preventable death and suffering are bad things. The impact is extinction, but the alternative solves. Alan 7, violence or not independent or inevitable historical psychological violence or causing condition. The pathology involves focusing on the means to decondition violent causal factors and conditions non-violent cause will lead to more non-violent results then will become new causal factors. If we do not understand the end response to the social framework, our short-term response will not be sufficient. That creates suffering and threatens human survival. Peace and education must focus on how we decondition ego-driven selfishness and defense mechanisms to responding to insecurity. Third is it completely turns the whole half, even if we don't win the all solve. So ego perception, violence, resistance empirically does nothing to change oppressive power structures. The the alternative doesn't preclude the majority of the AF's offense, we can agree the rejection of white being is good, and also reject the parts of the 1EC that endorse violent resistance. Drop down to the link debate. There are a couple. First is the Harney evidence. They have read evidence explicitly advocating, quote, cross-racial revolutionary violence and, quote, self-defense. If you need to think about it as such, you can think of it as a pick out of this card. The second is militancy and provocations, both words that the 1AC says they advocate. Quote, provocations prove the 1AC's, quote, refusal of the violent corrective and violent touch of white being would necessitate a violent reaction. Third is the race war analytic. Even if they win, their method is not explicitly violent. Their analytic of the race war gets misinterpreted by both white and black and brown people, which causes net more violence. That was the 2 and C. Fourth is the notion of a war is another link. Nuri, an end war normalizing metaphors naturalize military power, creating a systematic analogy between war and objects found far from the battlefield. War metaphors are discursive landmines that inflict harm on a culture and should be eliminated from political discourse. Discourses contribute to a confirmation of the already present ideologies, sustaining relations of control, the identification biases, opens a new window to latent processes by which ongoing the powerful groups and influence public opinion. Researchers have revealed the power of metaphors regarding war manipulation as a legitimate domination. Confirming inequality metaphors became to be viewed as a metaphor. Metaphors can create social reality. They can behave like self-fulfilling prophecies. Their reclarification is the link to framework, but no plan, no perm. Think of the K as a pick out of all of the links. It proves that it solves the entirety of the case. Even if they don't win even if they win none of these are about the method explicitly advocated by the 1AC, it doesn't matter because we've read dissents to the analytic that they use via their research. They say it goes af. Yes, they build relations, but it also creates violence, which is all the work I did above. They say the impact isn't unique. No, the impact isn't unique. Yes, it is. That was above any chance the athletes to more violence escalates, and we can all agree that wanton violence is bad. They say we're reading the Harney evidence wrong. Yes, you cause solidarity, but we're picking out of the rest of the analytics of the 1AC that we think are bad and embolden more violence. They say it's a question of models and a positionality, not oppositionality. We agree that their method can be good, which proves that the alternative solves the entirety of the case, but it just means that the cards that they read in the 1AC that do advocate for violence or cause more violence than the analytics of the 1AC's research cause more violence, which are bad. They say it's a they say the black and brown people are always considered as violent. This is the uniqueness claim is wrong. If the app worsens it, then it's probably try or die. And the alternative solves, but violence also isn't inevitable. That's intellectual and epistemological blackmail. Violence inevitable is a politically constructed claim that aids the powerful in their oppression and means we can never truly strive for peace. It was the Allen evidence from the overview. When the all solves, it obviously goes away. The permutation, no plan, no perm competition, derives from an understanding of the negative's resolutional burden. The perm is nothing more than the assertion that the negative has made that an argument doesn't contain a disadvantage to the plan and therefore isn't competitive. Given that the app is not defending literal instrumental implementation of the resolution, there's no theoretical basis for net beneficial competition. They've simply made an observation about the world and expressed an opinion about it. And given this, any counter method competes, which they have flagged at the top of the 2AC. Links or decides if we win, they involve violent resistance and doomsday strategy and the perm because violence and resistance overwhelms the non-violent part, which was the Barkowski evidence. It should be super clear they endorse violence, which was the link debate above. They say the conquer good evidence. They said that it should be a question of models, which means that we do get to pick out of parts of the 1AC because that is a better way to debate about the race war. If we can, we should be able to disagree with the 1AC, which is the whole 2AC on framework. They say the respectability card versus the links to them. They are also prescribing a method of politics that not all black people agree with. Second, we are debating them. They came to a tournament and read this affirmative knowing people would disagree with them. They can't get angry. We're telling them that their resistance methods are ineffective because that's the role of debate. Engaging with our strategy is the opposite of respectability. It's a sign of academic respect. We take their arguments seriously. What is the impact to it? If we win, their strategy causes more racial and gender violence, you should reject it. But exclusive focus on identity politics is bad. It presumes that we should only and always listen to black people, which means Condoleezza Rice was right about Iraq and Ben Carson was right about kicking black people from their houses. Also, yeah, that's fine.
Cool. 8.
have it. Huh? Yeah, correct. I need to see how much time we have. What is this? Yeah, yes. Case, nonviolence, T. I'm good. Not telling. Are we good?
Other cards?
No.
Okay. I'm good.
Vote affirmative for military preservation, similar to the holder party states the app, traces the code of logistics and turns inward to an indebted, incomplete field, creating a neural blockage that halts violent individuation, which saps social energy needed for black and brown students to endure the race war. Less than million evidence to see examples of extrajudicial killings, all right, policing, black debaters not inviting the roundabouts, all prove that the race war, all prove the race war. They've answered the race war out there, but not the race war in here, which is unique. This actually means that you have a categorical imperative to have lost the white debate community. That's the hardy evidence, yes. However, only about is arbitrary and also that's good during the race war framing issue, because these are theory of power about logistics, which will be answered later by the solvency arguments. No, this is though we're trying to solve the race war. We said the race war is inevitable. Do you want to see as an endurance mechanism still solves Jasmine contested? The white people are the argument how we can endure because white people take arms. No, it's a question of status quo. Logistics already preempts this. The reason this form of violence happens is because of how the code operates. But white people can't co-opt things like relationality and affect, which is something that only the affirmative policy mechanism can solve, because sociality is a blockage to the system of logistics. Our strategy as white nationalism's overwhelming argument doesn't make any sense because they can't overwhelm things like relationality. And even when they engage in peaceful reforms like their alternative people, like BLM gets shut down when SWAT teams are deployed, which proves the
which proves that there's only evidence of the affirmative solves not a race war arguments. No, it's not a question. Yes, there's a race war in debate, and we read a lot of evidence, and our theory of power will disprove this because their arguments about not race war right now only prove our waves and retreats arguments of how the race war occupies in waves and retreats, which is a uniqueness question that only proves our theory of power. The question is not irredeemable. No, we'll have our theory of power debate later, but the Riley evidence definitely does not indict the affirmative. It just proves uniqueness for our theory of power because it says that the race war is low now, but it'll just operate in resurgence and retreats, which is the Rodriguez evidence, and the logistics of the we just have the not race war. The Nazis don't want this to arc is terrible and silences black and brown students that are enduring the race war by forcing them to re-articulate themselves palatable to white people. It is the status quo, but there's only a risk that the 1AC theorization of the race war creates an urgency and categorical imperative for black and brown students to engage in the race war. The white people preemptively strike arguments. So that was already answered about the question of the BLM and the striking levels. They also sort of say surveillance is they say that surveillance is bad, but the F is opaque because think of it as how can you kind of co-opt things like relationality? The institution's key arguments are impacted by our theory of power. They cannot win this debate when they consider our theory of logistics violence has transitioned to the era of the code which infiltrates us neurological reforms operates within the white algorithm that relies on individuation causing communicative and racial violence, which gets replicated by institutions where they've conceded a circumvention argument about how violence gets circumvented from things like the slavery to Jim Crow to prison or Coppell proves that it co-opts therefore politics, which is also a massive decide to the alternative. Go to the K now. At the top, the K solves the entirety of the critique, also the permutation most definitely does, because we read a fantastic piece of Mona and Hardy evidence is that logistical sabotage. Their framing of violence is not a question of literally taking up arms, but of mode of sociality, because black and brown students are always positioned as violence in the status quo. There's only risk that the permutation solves. Yes, we get a problem because plan debates are terrible. We also solve the gendered violence arguments, but we have impact turner because the framing it as masculine, framing it as framing the F as masculine blames brown queer students in the status quo and mischaracterizes the one affirmative. Also the bystander killed arguments. No extinction is the status quo for black and brown students, and the F is a prerequisite because we create social honesty presumption arguments. No presumption that was on case. Hardy says that it could be violent, not that it has to be violent. Rather says this is a question of being indebted to each other, which proves that there's a massive link here. Also the provocation is not used in the context of the affirmative, but rather the other side. The refusal of violence does not necessitate violence in return, but rather mode of sociality, which is able to create love, which is what the 1AC talks about. The people misinterpreting argument. No, they only misinterpret if it's in the context of the affirmative strategy, which we've said it's a question of sociality and loving each other. Those who clarified in 1AC crosses the war metaphor does not get called because there's different representations of war. You only get links to the plan, which is impacted by the script essentials of arguments because relying on solely linguistics ignores how minorities are always kind of occupying extra linguistic spaces, which is an impact to their strategy. And also Sullivan evidence can be cross-applied here because it impacts the alternative because focusing on political strategies or prioritizing them over kind of sociality ensures psychological violence, which solves a lot of the office that they go for. And I get you one of our arguments if they're extrapolated later in the 2 hour. T. Debate is a microcosm of the race war, which means that you should put procedurals on hold because the sole question should be debatability. The sole question of this debate should be which side you take during the race war. Their insistence that debatability outweighs everything else proves the argument because it prioritizes proceduralism. Only our interp. They can have conceded the violence in here. They've conceded the argument about violence in here, which proves the debate should be a side of strategies to fight the race war. Only our interp forces this, and they've conceded that framing that you should be willing to risk it all. They have no external offense. They've got for clash is key to the game, but they have zero reasons why the game is good. We have impact on this game being good. They have to win that clash solves the race war. CX is embarrassing, but what is clash? Really is an urgency question. Yes, we get the F. It's a defense of our model debate. Logistics is proves that form is content because it infiltrated the cognitive linguistic process, and you can neurologically rewire, which means that every ballot does matter. This is proven by the Sullivan evidence. Their interforces rewiring are the political. The impact is cruel, hub causes psychological violence. The evidence they read in response to this is not in the context of the political counter. After must defend a Militant reading of the resolution solves all their offense because teams must defend Militant strategies like the BPP versus Opposites. Prove they have net ground, and it is predictable because Militant debate is predictable debate for teams that are Militant debate is predictable debate for students in their race, which is an argument that they've conceded. It is limited, and it's limited, and they have ground because they have to choose one strategy to refine that strategy. The individuation is that most definitely links because it's a form of topical debate. It's still a will to U.S. education politics. Our political projects as complete, which individuates us by focusing on violence out there without understanding how violence in here, which our counterinterpretation is able to resolve at the level of creating endurance strategies. The Hawthorne evidence is conceded and amazing and applies to debate. We'll give an example. Their debate for clash is not neutral, but it feeds into a form of liberal multiculturalism. The derision of TVAs, which is essentially add black participants. Sir, proven by when teams like Westwood, BS, where the TVA teams, policy teams go for a process counterplay, which is a form of not offering a seat at the table and a pathologization. The TV, the only example they give is the sabotage off, and around earlier proves that they don't get any skills from it. The switch side debates are impact term because false self-reflexivity, uniqueness question means race wars here, and switching sides to play devil's advocate disavows the need to choose our strategy to combat the race war, which is an argument that they've conceded. Yeah.
It's going to be T, the K, and then the case page. Okay. Is anybody not ready? Great. Our interpretation that after use must defend a hypothetical government action to reduce direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales. The impact is clash. It has to outweigh. It's the foundation of debate. There's a reason why we pour our heart and soul into this activity. We're all here for different reasons, but preserving the game matters to everyone. The other team, by asking for the ballot and the judge to evaluate arguments in round, is implicitly valuing the norms of the game. That makes any offense intrinsic. Good debates require a predictable limit on the topic that directs negative research. Otherwise, the negatives force to the margins to garner competition. This is magnified by the app's ability to shift advocacy in response to negative offense. This enables better research practice, more reflexivity, and nuanced understanding of policy, which is valuable regardless of your strategy for engagement or societal change. This also turns any education arguments because we're able to force us to the margins of the literature. There's also zero risk of app offense because debate is fundamentally competitive activity, and the app has no mechanism to substantially change the conditions of oppression described in the 1AC about the race war happening inside debate. Maximizing class is the only impact that the ballot can solve, but it also turns the case. Their strategy requires kind of pluralism and contestation to build up the movements to effectively engage in Topicality to fight back against fight back and endure the race war. At the top, Debate is not a kind of microcosm of the race war. Rather, it's a competitive activity. All of their examples about not inviting teams to the round robin, etc., are all examples of kind of outside of the debate in the broader community, which are inevitable. And which means it's not a piece of intrinsic offense because the counterplan can't overturn those systems. Clash is able to solve the race war. It allows us to test ideas and their effectiveness within their ability to effectively either endure or fight the race war in order to cut back against racism. The counterinterpretation, it's bad. It prevents, limits, and ground actors and mechanisms should frame the counterinterpretation debate. They conceded that their interpretation allows for an infinite number of actors and infinite number of mechanisms, which proves that there's no check on negative research. Ground is also not predictable, even if there are some strategies. It's not the predictable ground that's prepared pre-tournament and pre-round, which should frame it. Even the individualism, the individuation is that even if the app reads a plan that doesn't inherently distance ourselves from the kind of individuation that the Wednesday Evans indicates, the warrant for switch side debate was that it kind of leads us to distance ourselves from these far right arguments like the state being inevitably good, which means that switch side should probably also solve their offense. We can test how to fight the race war and different strategies to do it when neg, but the commitment stuff, committing to one strategy is obviously false because they have to refute the strategy when they are neg. The trade-off argument, it's false. Debates about kind of violence and how it functions internationally don't trade off with the kind of depictions of violence at home. That dichotomy is false and is actually violent. Examples like the 1033 just which I gave in Cross-Examination allow us to focus on how arms sales influence violence at home and how the government is currently fighting, or how police is currently fighting the race war. Clash being an example of multiculturalism is definitely wrong. There is not a clear link extended to how forcing teams to just read a plan, endorse hypothetical government action, and secure a stasis point actually links to this, and the two areas should get no new extrapolation. Yes, skills. Clash makes us more self-reflexive and allows us to better resist oppressive structures like the kind of institutional racism that the Gordon evidence. It also checks dogma because we distance ourselves from those far-right arguments, which means that we become better advocates and are able to fight it.
And so the game is bad in Sullivan evidence.
Oh yeah, the game is bad. It does a lot of the game of bad stuff was answered above on the overview, but the game is definitely good if we win the skills argument. The Sullivan evidence, the Mikey L. Evans directly answers this and kind of turns to indicate the optimism, and even if they're suspending a level of hope, that's uniquely good and causes better health outcomes. It kind of turns the psychic violence, which also has zero link to reading a plan.
But also, yeah, we don't force you to invest in the
Yeah,
state.
like we don't force you to invest in the state and the cruel optimism that the Sullivan evidence indicates. Good.
Should be fine.
Okay. Concede the permutation just says competition, like going for T. Any of the reasons why? Actually, no. Yeah. See the permutation. Good. Yeah. There is not a race war right now. The 1C evidence is actually really good, but more important is that it's the only card that passes the command F test for race war. It says that interracial violence is radically declining now. Their evidence relies on media hype, which the 1C Riley evidence makes a pretty specific indictment of. Says it ignores actual statistics. They've also dropped an indictment of all their evidence. It's from English professors who are not positioned to make broad sociological claims like the race relations is possible. Riley's a professor of political science who studies sociology, so you should prefer it line by line. For they say the ways in retreats argument. That's wrong. The Riley evidence says that the race relations have never been lower, which means there's higher, which means that there's a unique momentum to the end of the race war. Even if it was a retreat, it wouldn't be this huge. But more important thing is that the 2EC does not say wave nor retreat nor cyclical, and the 1EC does not have any evidence to back it. This is a fully new warrant. We didn't read more evidence in the blog about whether this is a wave war. They also dropped this extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Error strongly negative. Any risk that they're wrong throws race relations and progress out the window and replicates the violence and magnifies it. They say the violence in here argument. It's not offense for them. None of their examples in their context of arguments and about whether or not reading a plan. They're all about kind of races in the community, policing people, which is not intrinsic to topical debate, but the Riley evidence should disprove it because it also just proves that generally there is not a race war and race relations are trending upward now, should prove it's spilling over to debate.
How much do you have? 320. Okay, fair enough.
race war is real and happening now. Examples do prove extrajudicial killings that Burgess says he all right taking over the White House have seeped into debate. White logistics controls our relations. This sustains the process of individuation. The case debate gets filtered through. They have conceded that even if there's not a literal race war now, framing it as a race war is good for black and brown students. They've conceded it creates a sense of urgency and it creates epistemic certainty that there is violence happening now that urges sort of violence or urges militant strategies that are good to combat the race war. Their evidence does not say that there is no violence happening now, but that violence is on the low. They've conceded that categorizing that violence as the race war is good for black and brown students because it creates strategies and motivates actual change. The individuation stuff, it's bad when they've just said violence is happening now, not that institutions can change that violence, which means only our sort of micro-political strategy is good. We've read a phenomenal piece of Beller evidence in the 1AC that says violence doesn't operate through institutions, but logistics is infiltrated institutions. It's the break of modernity that sutures civil and requires black energy to sustain itself, but simultaneously exports forms of racial and communicative violence that reforms they cite or the perfection of the system, i.e. violence becomes hidden in more insidious ways. They say it's not in the 1AC or 2AC. Here's a literal quote from the 1AC: fluctuating between waves and retreats in which white supremacy is the backdrop. Also in the 2AC, check your flow. This is proven how slavery shifted to Jim Crow, shifted to modern day prison industrial complex, and continues. Examples of the race war also prove how movements of progress get cracked down upon, i.e. BLM. They want to work with the political, but they're responded to by SWAT teams. This means that they have a misdiagnosis to how violence operates, and institutional change will reappropriate the violence. They've conceded the circumvention arguments. The race war low now arguments is just uniqueness for our logistics ensures that violence operates in waves and retreats. Every example of positive change is counteracted, even if it's not accurate, and like they have indicts. But Beller says that neural blockings can be right, and it's a function of the code, which means that any institutional change doesn't solve. They say we need extraordinary evidence. They've conceded that the Beller evidence that through it's a cognitive function, not through material strategy, which means a form of clash or self-reflexivity can solve. Go to T. Debate is not just a game, but a microcosm of the race war. They say that the examples out there prove that there's no sort of race war, but the community itself sutures the way that debate goes down, the way violence happens within debate. There are violence and policing strategies, i.e. how when black and brown debaters get surveilled into rounds saying that their violence arguments are too against the state, the role of the ballot, they've conceded it. It should be to abolish the white debate community. That means you have a categorical imperative to put procedurals on hold and evaluate what sustained the real race war. That means if we went a 1% risk of a link that their model debate leads to sustaining the race war, you should vote affirmative. The individuation decide is mishandled, imagining our politics as complete and whole causes us to forget about each other. This is implicated by two arguments that are not answered. His only answer is just, no, it's not us. They've conceded the distancing decide that sometimes we forget we are the cops. Their idea that the international doesn't affect the domestic is wrong. It's that it doesn't affect us as individuals. It's not the domestic or the international. Those are both outside of our social spheres. It's a question of sometimes when we say the cops are fucked up, we forget that sometimes we are the cops. Sometimes we are the problem in interpersonal relations, which allows us to distance ourselves from violence and results in passive activism. The soul of it evidence. It is functionally conceded. Their model debate that poses cipher anti-black rejects results in racial battle fatigue. The only answer is that optimism is good. It is not in the terms of the political. We still think that hope is good in terms of sociality and creating those communities of care, but not political hope. Their card doesn't say political once. You should read it. Black hope tears down the body systems by creating hypertension that intensifies psychological violence and literally results in generalized anxiety and heart attacks. Community have functional dissent against their interpretation of topicality. They've the counter-interpretation extended. Alice must have a militant reading the resolution. It solves all their offense because they've not gone for an external impact. They said the game is good, but have not justified why the game is good. It's embarrassing when they have not read a card that says why discussing arms sales policy is good. The whole evidence, it's not in this debate. They say clash of the foundation debate. We've impacted our debate since it sustains the race war, and only counter-interpretation solves because it forces debates over the race war. They say there are different reasons for preserving the game, but we think that those reasons should not be just to learn general self-reflexivity skills, but skills to fight the race war. Otherwise, it results in heart attacks for black debaters. They say better research and reflexivity. You should remember that awkward moment in cross-sex where you just get embarrassed. What about the app or learning about the TVA results in sort of interpersonal skills at how we react to each other, which is a unique net benefit to our interpretation because the race war is real and happening to the debaters in the space. They say it's a competitive activity, but they conceded that there's a neural cognitive linguistic argument that proves that the ballot can be read for institutional change. It's an iterative process that says round after round it's self-reflexive, and it's also a question of models of debate, which means our model of debate is better. You vote affirmative. They say debate is a competitive activity. We've impact term that says that Bewley sold as competitive activity is bad because it disincentivize the way that there's sort of violence in that community in the first place. They say clash checks ideas are inter solves, which promotes clash and concedes societies and gray area. It says that it votes militant debates a counter-interpretation. They say actors and mechanisms. Here's what wins us the debate. They've conceded militant debate is predictable for black and brown students. White people, fuck them. We don't need them. They have conceded it's a categorical imperative because the role of a judge is only to abolish the white debate community. So who cares about their net ground or their actors or mechanisms? The individuation just had frames that they said, no, the suicide debate doesn't solve their offense because it's an a priori question of picking aside. The Melwood evidence says that oppositional politics are bad because they get infiltrated by the state, saying the state-centric frame which does not create social energy, not present, and the two and are also not IR and domestic, but us as individuals, it proves that they're in their out there distinction is wrong.
Should put the Chipotle away then.
What do we?
Who should be like? Should I be like speaking?
Yeah, there should be one of us.
Wait, let's both.
Yeah, pretend to cross it. Someone else could.
Oh, perfect.
I don't
Okay,
know
this
cross-X.
stand.
I don't
There.
know cross-X.
Perfect.
Gesticulate.
I'll hold the timer. I'm gonna look at you.
Perfect.
Can't smile. Why do you smile? I'm gonna pretend like I'm saying words, just like I would at cross-X.
I will pretend like I'm answering just
Okay.
like I did in cross-X
Good.
and looking at the judges because that is standard procedure.
I totally do that at cross-X.
Okay, thank you.
I can't wait to be famous.
I don't think that's covered. I never know because I know you're supposed to do those compensation, but congratulations for making it to the level of what am I doing that the decision that I'm not that's yourself.
Thank you for summoning me.
Okay, congratulations to both teams for a really excellent debate in the quarterfinals of the BFHS. The decision is a 3-0 for the Affirmative Coppell. Okay. I voted app because I don't think that the neg has explained how their interp resolves the questions of racial violence and distancing within debate, or explained how the interp provides a better strategy to confront or address that violence. I think the main issue for the neg is the lack of characterization of impact comparison through engagement with the app arguments. I think you do a good job of explaining kind of in theory what your arguments are, but never really clash or contextualize them for how they interact with solve, turn, whatever with the app offense. And at no point in the Q&A is there an explanation of kind of how you either resolve their offense or solve through different versions of either a TBA or a switch side debate to access that offense. I thought there were two main arguments that the app won. The first piece of offense is the individuation DA that the app and topic just as included under the neg interp create bad forms of education because they focus on domestic and international issues rather than urgent violence facing debaters here. In this case, I tried to only value arguments I think were definitely grounded in 1AR because I do think some of the 2AR explanation characterization of this argument was new. I don't have an effective answer from the neg about what happens in how debates shape the way that black and brown debaters are treated within the debate space. For example, the arguments introducing debating the root cause of racialized surveillance against those debaters. I think that the neg could effectively counter the arguments about out there versus in here by explaining offense about why debates centered around individuals or individual survival strategies and experiences are bad, such as unpredictability or forcing the neg to negate personal experience. I don't think that you all have articulated why the education and skill sets gained from your forms of clash specifically access their impact or how to solve things like black battle fatigue. I think that you have the tools through the theoretical explanation of class, but you need to answer some of the external offense about why the arguments require why you would actually provide a better strategy. I think that the argument about the 1033 dissat is a good start, but you need a much stronger push on why one clash is necessary to those discussions' effectiveness, and a stronger 2 in our focus on why, for example, race wars can be international and that reduction of arms in the hands of governments would be a good thing. I think the second piece of offense the app wins is about militant strategies being predictable for black and brown debaters. I'm not convinced that the 1AR explicitly extended a role of the ballot argument, but I do think it consistently argued that, given the uniqueness question, black and brown debaters should be prioritized in this space. And I think that the best argument to answer this early on was like the switch side debate and TVA stuff, but it wasn't a big enough part of the 2NR or explained in this context. And I don't think you explicitly explained why self-reflexivity or clash through 3rd and 4th line responses to create better advocacies solves that. For the case debate, I thought it was a lot of kind of ships passing in the night on both sides. I think the neg had strong evidentiary indictment for the concept of the race war in recent examples, but the one app argument that I think you dropped is that the framing and language of the race war is important even if it's not materially happening now, and the offense about social energy required from black and brown debaters, which is associated with that. So given that 1AR argument, the neg needed to extend defense or reasons why that framing is bad or at least unnecessary in the world of resolutional debate, and that wasn't in the 2NR. The most important thing I think that you all could do on T is to paint a picture of what their counterinterp looks like and how those debates play out. For example, if the neg researched a counter strategy, would the app be able to sidestep or no link that even against a competitive K? What would those debates look like? Even if the team didn't do that, what is the precedent in the world of the app, and why would that be net worse for education, class skills, etc. I also think a bigger focus on pre-tournament and pre-season prep would be good, because even if there are reasons why this is good in this space, why is that stuff that you do beforehand more important?
I voted F. I thought that the race war is a thing, and that the AF model and framework would allow us to fight or endure it, and the negative model, I'm not sure how people could fight it or endure it. I think, similarly to what Will just said, calling it a race war, even if it's not at its peak of what a true race war might look like, was important. I think this like wax waves argument is supported in all of the app speeches and with evidence, so calling it a race war and trying to overhype it on purpose is important to mobilize people towards urgent action and to choose a side and to research strategies for people already involved in that. Violence is valuable if people are going to survive or endure it. Some unanswered questions I had at the end for the neg were like, if a race war exists and people need strategies, should I put T on hold? What is the negative position on that? Or if I decide a race war exists, can the neg still win? It seems like if your answer is yes, then you would have to win that the negative framework model allows better ways to solve that, or better ways to have a strategy to endure the race war. The neg model of like yes clash, yes limiting what counts as an AF is good because it limits what research needs to be done to test if any given strategy against the race war or to endure a race war works. I wasn't sure what it is about reading and defending a plan that is useful to fight the race war or become more self-reflexive. I would echo Will in that the 1033 DA may be a good start, but you need some more about like why optimism and macro political strategies is useful, why faith in the political is good, and maybe why faith in sociality, cognitive linguistic changes, or just like any evidence about haptics of care being bad. And would need to disprove that militant readings of the resolution are good for fighting the race war, and that plans are not only good for that, but that plans are like good for some external things beyond fighting the race war too. And kind of weirdly enough, I thought that there was a very defined role for what a negative ought to do to clash with the affirmative that they're explaining in all of the AF speeches. Like if you really want to test and refine strategies to endure the war, then you should research things like Black Lives Matter, Zapatistas, haptics of care, fail or work stuff. That's what they're saying is their vision for what a negative team ought to do. So they're not saying that clash is like impossible, and if debate really is just like competitive, if this app is deemed topical, everyone will research those methods and try to win a debate. So there would be a fine amount of clash. I don't know how the other judges feel about this, but I kind of thought the negative should have gone for the critique. You would just like do everything the app does, and as long as you can win some compelling reason why a war metaphor is bad or could be interpreted as violent, that would be like good. I think the 1AR makes a mistake in not extending the like scriptocentrism DA, that choosing aspects of our app but ignoring the broader thesis of sociality, or at least I didn't have that argument as the focus of the 1AR. If you don't have that argument in, then I think as long as they can prove some reason why war metaphors are bad but do all of the rest of the affirmative, they would just win. I mean, they'd also, I guess, have to prove why the permutation still links, but it would be a much easier way for the negative to win, in my mind.
Yeah, this is a 3-0, but it doesn't, for me, reflect how close this debate was, and I, in particular, hemmed and hawed and changed my mind several times in the half hour after this debate as I was kind of making my decision. And ultimately, what I struggled with is that I do think that there is a degree of 1AR under coverage versus what I think was a relatively poor impact speech from the 2NR. And I'll echo Liliana on kind of the lack of contextualization. And I think that you're relying on kind of your overview about the generic benefits of Flash to do a lot of heavy lifting versus all of the app offense. And it's a rare thing for me to say these days after these debates. Usually my advice is the opposite, but I thought the 2NR didn't spend enough time talking about things like a TVA, because I agree with the neg in principle that the app isn't great at proving that a lot of their disads are intrinsic to topical or plan-based action, and yet in the face of that kind of broad brush accusation, you need to do a better job of presenting some counterexamples that create that necessary linkage between advocating plans and kind of cruel optimism, advocating plans and kind of violent individuation, and so on and so forth. I also agree with Becca on a couple things. One is that the way I resolved the case debate on the race war is that even if I think that you are correct that we are not literally in a race war, that framing is good, even if not strictly true, because it creates epistemological certainty and awareness of ongoing violence. And I also think that you might have been in better shape to go for the K. I think here the AF is relying a lot on this kind of like, but our advocacy of relationality / affect couldn't be misunderstood or co-opted, to do a lot of heavy lifting for them. And the reality is when like your speech gets clipped out and posted on InfoWars, the white supremacists that are co-opting are not engaging with the nuance of like your Harney and Moan methods and so on and so forth. So I think that might have been a stronger option for the 2NR. I thought that consider on the negative advancing something of a kind of permutation argument to the counterinterpretation. In other words, try to explain how a militant reading of the resolution is not necessarily exclusive with kind of limited agents / mechanisms, and that in combination with some kind of specific counterexamples of the TVA to kind of break the necessary or intrinsic linkage between topical plan action and their disads would help a lot for me at least. I think that, like I said, you're relying a lot on kind of flash / reflexivity to answer a lot of the dissats as we don't necessarily result in this without these kind of good counterexamples. I did struggle for a while with kind of the idea that the ballot itself cannot resolve racial violence outside of this room, but it can resolve clash, which is a strong argument I hear you advancing in the 2NR. I don't think that the app is great in terms of your on-point response to it, but there is implicit response, at least in kind of terms of your theory of how the ballot works to rewire neural blockages, to combat violent individuation, and create methods of enduring. I do think it kind of dovetails with your race war framing good, in that militant strategies like this can maybe create that kind of epistemological certainty or energy to endure oppression. I partially think this is kind of bullshit, but I think the negative pushback isn't great here. I think that role of the ballot wasn't particularly decisive for me. I agree, I didn't have a great 1AR extension of that, and I think the NAG has at least been implicitly clear that their kind of response to the question of the role of the ballot is probably a response to the resolutional question. It still ultimately ends up being kind of a comparison of these different models of debate, whereas your role of the ballot seems like a more specific example of how the app operates as a militant strategy. I do think that the app needs better ground defense, okay? I think that you need to kind of use some of the aspects of your 2AC counterinterpretation to say, look, it's not unlimited, right? That our interpretation requires, one, that it's germaneness to the resolution. The text of the counterinterpretation is a militant reading of the resolution itself, so it's not like we could talk about literally anything. It seems to imply that the actors are militant resistance movements / are probably non-state actors, and continue. That combined with some of your arguments about the non-uniqueness of limits explosion on this topic, et cetera, makes that kind of comparison less decisive for them in terms of the limits debate. I do think that I voted AF because I think that they have some strong offense that outweighs the neg impact component of the 2NR and both the individuation DA as well as the racial battle fatigue DA. And like I said above, I hear you on those aren't intrinsically tied to your model of debate, but I think concretizing those examples really helps me because you're really just kind of asking me to vote on 100% no link to these DAs, and I need kind of something more firm to grasp onto there. I also agree with the affirmative distinction on kind of the level at which the competing hope cards operate. I do think that their Sullivan card is talking about kind of why liberal faith and reformism is bad, and that your response is more kind of like in health settings, kind of being optimistic about the possibility of good outcomes is a good thing. Inside, outside, I think that I probably agree with the kind of AF pushback on the distinction here. I think that you largely interpreted this as a foreign domestic trade-off argument, and the AF kind of pushes back and says focusing on violence that is outside of the room disavows violence within the debate community. It does beg the question of whether their model can do anything to resolve or promote, better endurance of that violence, and the NEG has questioned whether kind of this violent, colorblind multiculturalism is intrinsic to the reading of the plan, but this again goes back to my central point. I also think that kind of a big technical issue for me was the lack of 2NR response to kind of like the militant debate is broadly predictable for folks that find themselves within the race war. Although I don't know that like addresses the questions that you advanced about the lack of limits or ground for their counter-interpretation, but I just need a little bit better impact from that.
One thing I would add also about the K is I think if you make link arguments based on the 2AC to T, you'd be also in a good position because a model based on militancy and even a lot of the language of the 2AC, which I think you might want to change, is alternatives to your model pacify, which is something that more clearly draws that distinction between your model being one associated with militancy. And I think you should just make sure that you're not just focusing on the 1AC, but also the linguistic choices in Cossacks and in the 2AC to help bolster the link wall.
Y'all have any other questions?
I'm good.
Great debate, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you for judging. Sorry I had to throw out.